Welcome to your Biomes video part 1. This is an overview of why biomes are where they are in the globe, and then a specific look at forests. The rest of the biomes will be covered in a second video. Alright, why are biomes where they are? Two primary factors are abiotic, precipitation, and temperature. Fluctuations in these, even by the smallest amount, determines what type of plants grow there, which in turn determines the assortment of consumers that are there as well. Related concepts in terms of where biomes are placed are altitude and latitude, placement with respect to convection cells, and climate. We're going to talk about those in just a few minutes. All right, the placement of biomes are mirrored above and below the equator. So if you imagine the equator as a mirror, whatever is above the equator at a similar distance from the equator below it, it's the same thing. So it's different latitudes, and I'll explain what a latitude is in just a few minutes. All right, the listed biomes are all of the things that you need to know. Please recognize that these are kind of loose delineations between different areas, because if you remember, you have things like ecotones and mosaics of biomes that exist in real life, but this is just kind of a general way for us to look at the globe and understand why there are different things in different places. When you study these, comparing and contrasting is really important. Where do you find large herbivores? Which biome is one of the most fragile? Which one is the rarest? Where do you find the highest amount of biodiversity? And so on and so on. So you have a biomes cheat sheet put together, or you should at some point before the test. That's going to be a key piece of information for you to study. All right, what exactly is climate? That is an average atmospheric condition over hundreds of years. Lots of data was taken, again, temperature and precipitation, which allows us some ability to predict. However, weather is what's happening today when you walk outside. As we all know, you can expect certain temperatures and level of rain at certain times of year, but sometimes you walk outside and you get a surprise. And that's where you remember Mark Twain's quote, "Climate is what we expect, weather is what we get." All right, convection cells are another thing that play into why biomes are where they are. If you're familiar with the Michelin Man, this is something I'll go over in class. He's the dude made out of tires. So those 6 cells that are around the globe there, imagine those as tubes that stretch like tires all the way around the Earth. So there are these 6 tubes of air, 3 above the equator, 3 below the equator. Each one stretches through 30 degrees of latitude, and they are named as follows. The 2 closest to the equator, the ones that are above and below the equator that stop at 30 degrees above and 30 degrees below the equator, are called the Hadley cells. The cells that stretch from 30 degrees to 60 degrees, those are called feral cells. And then the ones that are up at the top of the globe and the ones that are at the bottom of the globe are polar cells. Now, why do we care about these things? Well, first of all, how do convection cells work? Hot air rises, cold air falls. This is where a lot of our wind patterns come from. Here's why you should care. Look at where those cells meet, and you'll see that there are delineations of biomes. One of the most important trends to note is that at 30 degrees above and below the equator, where those 2 cells go away from each other, the Hadley and the feral cells move away from each other. Those, because of the circulation, are warm and dry. So where those 2 things meet is where you're going to find most of the world's deserts, at 30 degrees above the equator and 30 degrees below the equator. That is something for you to know. Coriolis Effect is another thing that plays into wind patterns, and that is that the atmosphere turns at a slightly different speed than the Earth below it. And also when you are in the air, you kind of have to curve in order to keep up with the way that the globe is turning. If this is not making sense to you because this is not a static thing that's going on, go ahead and watch this very short YouTube video that's up on the slide. You can remember you can access these slides on my website if you need to get the specific URL. But that is just be aware in the most basic sense what the Coriolis effect is and what it does. All right, you need to know what latitude and altitude are. Latitudes are the distances north or south of the equator measured in degrees. Altitude is the height of an object above sea level, excuse me. As latitude and altitude increase, biomes and vegetation change. Here are some examples. If you look at the top part of this illustration, it shows you that as you go from the equator towards the North Pole, you transition from the tropical rainforest to the tundra. Similarly, if you go from the bottom of a mountain that's in the tropical rainforest to the top, you will go through a virtually identical transition of biomes. So again, latitude as you move towards the pole, or altitude as you go from the base to the top. That is when you see a gradual but predictable change in biomes. So you do need to know in general that you transition from one sort to the other. The ones that are listed here are not the full picture. This is just to get you used to the idea of the transition. Here's another way to think of it in terms of going up a mountain. Here is yet another picture for you. So whichever one of those makes sense to you in your brain, that's the one to pay attention to. All right, so in general, you need to be able to pick out places on the globe that have certain biomes. The easy ones to pick out are, again, the hot deserts at 30 degrees above and below the equator, the taiga and the tundra, very easy to pick out, grasslands, not that tough, tropical rainforest, smack dab on the equator. Some of the other ones might be a little bit more difficult. My suggestion is that you remember a representative country or area in which each of the biomes can be found. Please remember the difference between a country and a continent. All right, the country of Chad is in the continent of Africa. Africa is not a country. Please make sure you keep that straight in your head. All right, this is kind of a comparison chart of conditions between all of the biomes. Transitions from wet to dry, transitions from hot to cold. So this particular picture may help you arrange the biomes in your mind in terms of comparing and contrasting conditions between all of them. All right, I'm going to go ahead and speed through these biome descriptions simply because the ones that are in your textbook are very, very good, and then your workbook also has some supplemental information. So if I were you, I would get my little grid of biomes and just kind of fill in any extra little notes you feel like you need to do. All right, I'm going to start with the boreal forest, which is located in the areas that are in dark green there on that map. All right, boreal plants. Most of the plants are what are called conifers, or they're called coniferous trees, or they're called evergreen trees. Let me explain why. Conifer trees do not reproduce through flowers. They reproduce, not through fruit, but they reproduce through seeds in cones, thus conifer. So that's where you have spruce and fir and cedar, those types of trees that have the spiking needle-like leaves that don't fall off the tree and have a wax cuticle, which is an outer coating, to kind of help protect it from the elements and then also help it conserve water. If you've ever been in a very cold environment, you know that you get very dry very quickly just because of the very dry conditions. When it's cold, it's usually very dry. So that helps it conserve water. Remember, you cannot use snow as a source of water for living things. Also notice the shape of the conifers, which are the left-hand tree and the middle tree. They're kind of that pyramidal shape. The reason that they're like that instead of like the spreading live oaks that we see here in Southwest Florida is that that shape sheds snow. Imagine what a live oak would be like up north. It would catch all the snow and its spreading limbs, and then they would break off. So even the shape of the tree helps it to survive its particular conditions. Doesn't drop its leaves. Now, the tree on the far right, the aspen tree, that is a what's called a deciduous tree. It does drop its leaves in winter, but the majority of the trees that you find in the boreal forest um, are the ones on the left. Boreal forest is also called the taiga. I just like saying that name. All right, boreal animals. You really need to know what adaptations that they have that allow them to survive the really cold temperatures. Um, think about what you would do if it gets cold. You could leave, which is migrate. You could sleep through the whole thing, which is hibernate. Or you could have adaptations that allow you to get around, like thick fur, thick bodies. You burrow underground and you only come out in the middle of the day. Some animals, like the snowshoe hare that you see right here, actually change colors depending on the season. All right, here are some more boreal animals. You've got a moose, a lynx, snowshoe hare, Steller's jay, beaver, grizzly bear, and wolverine. On a multiple choice quiz, I'm not going to sit there and list animals and ask for you to pick out the one that's in the boreal forest or the one that's not. This is more for an AP exam when you're asked during an FRQ. It's one of those throwaway, you either know it or you don't type points. Say, name at least one animal that you can find in the boreal forest. And so my suggestion is pick an animal that resonates with you, commit it to memory, and there is one of the cards that you will pull out during the AP exam. All right, temperate deciduous forests. Those are the typical four-season forests that you see in the United States, and again, all of the other areas that you see there in that bright emerald green. You have a definite fall, winter, spring, summer, and you have what are called deciduous trees. Those are broadleaf trees. The leaves are soft. They're edible. One thing I didn't bring up about the evergreen leaves is that they're usually highly acidic. If you've ever looked around a pine tree, even here in Southwest Florida, you'll notice nothing grows underneath it. It's because the trees exhibit something called allelopathy. When they drop their leaves, it renders the soil too acidic for anything else to grow. So it actually creates its own herbicide that does not affect itself. Deciduous trees, on the other hand, not so much. They're a food source, and they drop their leaves in the wintertime and they go into dormancy. Other adaptations of this type of tree, it's just largely the dropping of the leaves in winter. There's no point for it to try and continue to do photosynthesis when it's just better to kind of hang on to its whatever it's stored up and just kind of make it through the winter. All right, here's the secret question. If deciduous trees drop their leaves in winter, what happens to the overall concentrations of carbon dioxide in the air? This is again in the air in winter in the northern hemisphere, I should say, because the southern hemisphere has opposite seasons than we do. So here's a hint. Take a look at this graph and think about photosynthesis when you're answering that particular question. All right, animals that you find in the deciduous forest. Again, this is prototypical animals that you could expect to find in a forest here in the United States. Fox, deer, earthworms, mountain lion, any sort of bird of prey. It's a goshawk. Migratory birds in the summertime. A lot of the birds leave in the winter. The smaller guys, just because there's no food for them to eat. Animals migrate if the conditions are too harsh or if they don't have a food source or a water source. All right, next forest is the tropical rainforest, right along the equator in all of the areas that are delineated there. All right, the layers of the rainforest. Starting from the bottom, there's the forest floor. Not a lot of light there because the top layers basically grow together so closely that not a lot of light hits the ground. There's also not a lot of wind, meaning that it is dark and muggy in the forest the majority of the time. So you also have to think that plants cannot pollinate by wind. There's got to be a lot of symbiotic relationships going on there so that organisms can help to spread the pollen from place to place. Right, then you have some shrubs and the understory, which is kind of all the shorter dudes. Then you have what's called the canopy. And that's where the majority of those trees grow together so densely that they block sunlight from hitting the floor. And then you have what's called the emergent layer. That's where every so often you've got this extra tree that's kind of poking up out of the top. Highest level of biodiversity of any of the biomes. Lots and lots of stuff going on there. So, because there's so much plant life there, and because it is so warm, when anything dies, it doesn't take very long at all for it to decompose. And the second those nutrients become available to the trees, they immediately get sucked up into the trees. So, lots of growth, very little nutrition in the soil. This is going to be a point that we come back to when we start talking about agriculture and slash and burn farming that goes on in Brazil, which is where there's a lot of tropical rainforest, and why it is that doesn't work very well. Okay, again, pick a plant. Mahogany trees, if you notice the trees in the rainforest, actually, let me go back. The larger trees, if you look at where the arrow is right now, grown as something called a buttress. It's these kind of wall type things that are sticking out from the tree. It makes, I would say, a tripod, but there's more parts than that sticking out. It's like the base of a table. It kind of grows out towards the bottom so they don't fall over. Because there's not a lot of nutrition in the soil, roots are very shallow, and so they have to kind of grow wide at the bottom so that they don't topple over. Orchids and other plants like that are called epiphytes. Remember, that's commensalism. They are growing up high and absorbing nutrients out of the air with their roots, but they're not actually damaging the tree. They're just trying to get up where they can get a hold of nutrients from decaying matter and then just from water in the air. All right, rainforest animals. Again, there's about 11 billion different things in the rainforest. Pick one. Margay, tapir, spider monkey. The reason it says arboreal is because those things spend 99% of their lives not touching the ground. And then toucans. All right, temperate rainforests. Not very common. Don't see a lot of questions on this, but just be aware of where they are. New Zealand is a great place to remember because that's virtually the entire island. Also the Pacific Northwest. So you're going to find this mix of conifers and deciduous trees there. And here are some representative examples. Tropical dry forest, again, you don't find it very often. Here's a difference between the tropical dry forest, what's called a tropical deciduous forest, and a tropical rainforest, is that the trees in this forest actually drop their leaves. They have significant dry seasons and then really, really wet seasons. Just think about India and the idea of a monsoon. They go through very dry seasons, so it's not the winter that causes these trees to shed their leaves and go dormant. It's the fact that they don't have access to water. So that's what forces them into dormancy, and thus the dry part. So they have very dry seasons and very wet seasons. Anyway, here are some representative plants and animals. If you just think about India, you're in good shape. And that brings us to the end of this particular video. Biomes Part 2 is coming up next in a separate video, so go over there